Thank you so much, Julia, and hello, everybody. We'll dive right in. So the UN General Assembly High-Level Week, it came and went so fast and was so eventful from a digital perspective, among many others, that it's really great to have this chance now, just a couple of weeks later, to hear from others about the digital themes and takeaways that stood out to them and what the next steps that they're planning to take. Just briefly from ITU side, a key message from our Secretary General about the Summit of the Future was the fact that, among other things, was a great day for digital and the importance of implementation. And we were really pleased in that context to see more than $1 billion in pledges announced to close digital divides, and many, many solutions from around the world presented, for instance, at SDG Digital, convened by UNDP and ITU during this key period. As you see before you, we've assembled some terrific speakers to share their digital perspectives and takeaways from the experience at UNGA and the Summit of the Future. As you can see on the screen, we have Rob Opp, Chief Digital Officer, UNDP, Sally Radwan, Chief Digital Officer, UNEP, Fui Meng Liu, Chief of Digital Center of Excellence at UNICEF, Isabel de Sola Criado, Special Advisor, Office of the Secretary General's Envoy in Technology, Luisa Franco Machado, Young Leader for the SDGs, UN Network of Experts on AI, and Shri Yeshwant Tadmala, UN Youth Technology Focal Point. And thank you so much all for joining us. We're really looking forward to hearing from you shortly. There are 3 parts of this brief session. The first one is about key digital trends, themes and insights from UNGA and the Summit of the Future. Part 2 is focused on a key outcome, the Pact for the Future and the Global Digital Compact. And part 3 is what's next, actionable takeaways. And then we'll have audience Q&A. So we're asking our speakers to be very succinct so we have some good time for that. And as was mentioned, you can already start typing your questions into the Q&A function on the screen and upvote other questions that you see there as well. So without further ado, first question to you, Rob. What were the standout digital developments from your perspective from this year's UN General Assembly and Summit of the Future, and your key takeaways? And hoping you mention also SDG Digital. Go ahead, Rob.
Sure. Thanks, Ursula. And hi, everybody. It's great to be here with you. And I mean, there's a lot to say, and I don't want to, there'll be a lot of other perspectives and things. So let me just give a little bit of kind of the historical background a little bit, because, I really started to engage in this space about 5 years ago. And if you recall, Ursula, we were working at that point on the SDG's Digital Cooperation Roadmap, and some things like that we're talking about some of these issues. But to be frank, digital in the General Assembly space in 2019 was, it was a thing, but it was not a big thing, that's for sure. And of course, as we went through COVID and there were a couple of years of sort of quiet UNGAs or virtual UNGAs and things, but it started it's kind of crescendoed again. And last year we did the first SDG Digital together with UNDP and ITU, which had a huge response to it. And this year, of course, we had determined to do the same again. But to our surprise, as you know, we were selected as one of the 3 action days to be featured alongside a couple of the other themes as part of the Pact for the Future. So already there was a signal that digital was going to be a huge part of this year's General Assembly, and in fact it was. And so we were happy to do with ITU and the Tech Envoy's office the full action day, where we covered a lot of the kind of innovative digital solutions that are being brought to bear against the SDGs to make progress and accelerate our progress. And then we had, I think, what was it, over 40 speakers in the space of 5 hours during the morning. The afternoon featured a couple of panels related to the Global Digital Compact and the AI high-level panel. And so we had a packed room all day. And I got some of the statistics from the UN Web TV, where it was also broadcast. And we had about 10,000 views, or have had about 10,000 views on the SDG Digital portion of the day as well. So clearly a huge interest. Now, just coming really quickly to some of the issues, and I'll let other speakers pick up on those, but a big thing for us as UNDP has been the space of digital public infrastructure. And that is a space that really didn't exist a few years ago, as a term anyway. And it basically it's the sort of aggregation of the experiences around how to put layers of foundational technology in place, and put it in a way that's governed and puts people at the center and has safeguards, et cetera, related to it. And how do we move this agenda forward, which took a big step forward last year in SDG Digital, last year in the G20 with Indian presidency. And this year we launched together with the Tech Envoy's office, the Digital Safeguards Framework. And there was a lot of activity and interest around that as part of the Global Digital Compact. So we now have the first universal UN intergovernmental document and agreement that has a reference to the importance of digital public infrastructure. That digital capacity was a huge issue this year as well, with lots of discussion in the Global Digital Compact around it, and how are we going to approach that as a community. And of course, AI, which I won't go into depth, but everywhere you look this year, there were discussions about not just AI, the technology, but the equity issue related to AI. So how do we ensure that as AI technologies are being rolled out, and how do we ensure that there's an equity principle embedded in that? And so many interesting discussions. We had the Digital Action Day, but then, I think I had like 10 other speaking engagements. Our administrator had lots of others, all related to one or the other piece of all of what I'm talking about. So just huge interest across the board this year. But I'll let others fill in some of those pieces as well.
Thanks so much, Rob. And not very necessarily scientific, but we estimate that at least, I think, 20% of the events and things that went on had a digital character, or were focused on digital.
I hadn't heard that number, but that's fantastic.
So the next question is for you, Sally Redwan, Chief Digital Officer of UNEP. Sally, your office leverages digital solutions to accelerate environmental goals. What are some of the key insights or developments from UNGA, the Summit of the Future, from your side that have been most impactful for your work?
Thank you, Ursula, and hi, everyone. It's always difficult to go after Rob, but since he was so generous as to leave the Global Digital Compact for me to comment on, I'll comment on that. And of course, always wearing the environmental hat and covering it from the environmental lens. I think for us at UNEP, as you said, my office works at the nexus between technology and environment. What that means is, how can we deploy technologies, including AI, of course, for the benefit of the environment, but then also how do we also make them environmentally responsible, which is the other side of the coin and equally important. And from that perspective, the GDC delivered somewhat, but I think it was those of you who were those of you who are not very familiar with it, the Global Digital Compact is one of the two annexes to the Pact of the Future that was adopted at the summit, but it also had its own separate negotiation process that was quite long and difficult. And one of the things that we learned from that is really the importance of holistic solutions. We talk about that a lot, but I think it has never been clearer than during that negotiation process, where you had member states objecting to things just because they felt that they would only address one part of the issue and not the whole issue. So I'll give you an example from the environment. Now, when we talk about an issue like floods or land degradation or sand and dust storms, which are all issues that the world faces today in different parts, you can no longer talk about these in a silo or a vacuum. You also have to see what impact they have on economic activities, on migration, on poverty, on health. Rob talked about DPI, a really important aspect for growth for developing countries. But then, as he also said, if you don't make them sustainable, then they really are not sustainable, then they start harming the environment in which they exist, including the people and the ecosystems. And at the same time, if we start talking about things like AI, we can't, I always have this saying that, you know, everyone talks about the AI race, but it's really not a race because we're not all starting from the same point. And so you get countries that really need to start talking about having the right infrastructure in place, not even digital infrastructure, but electricity and running water that you need to be able to power those machines in the first place. And then you start climbing the entire stack until you reach AI. Whereas for other countries, it's, oh, we're already at the top of AI, what more can we do? And everything in between. So what the GDC process taught us is that it's really important to think across that entire spectrum in terms of the different development needs of different countries and regions, but also across domain with UN agencies working together and collaborating to form holistic solutions. From a UNEP perspective, we're happy that we managed to have a number of paragraphs in the compact related to the environment and the environmental sustainability, especially for AI, which, as we know, has a pretty significant environmental footprint. And as Rob mentioned, there were lots of events going on around the Summit of the Future. And in one of them, we launched a new issues note on the environmental footprint of AI, which we're hoping to collaborate with all UN agencies on developing further and having a program of work that helps us quantify and mitigate the environmental impact of AI and other digital technologies. I'll stop here and give a chance for others to speak, but happy to jump in later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Sally. So the next question is for Fui-Meng Liu, Chief of Digital Center of Excellence, UNICEF. What were the most significant insights linked to digital and key takeaways that stood out to you?
Thank you, Ursula. And first of all, thank you for having me here today. I have to say, it is hard to go behind Rob and Sally, but I'll give it a try. We all know that those of us that have been to UNGA, it is a very overwhelming experience. So many events and so many people to meet and things like that. From my perspective and from UNICEF perspective, at the digital realm, hands down, the adoption of the Global Digital Compact as part of the Pact for the Future is one of the most impactful as from what we see. Never before we have a comprehensive framework for global governance of digital technology and artificial intelligence. It is also a whole of United Nations effort bringing together the member states as part of the process, just like how the Sustainable Development Goal gives us the future of the world that we aspire to. I do think that the GDC actually gives us the pragmatic way of how in the UN organization and together with the member states and countries on the ground that work together so that we can push the narrative of digital. So one of the few key takeaways from UNICEF's perspective, UNICEF is a child rights organization. And as we are in the digital world, it actually also impacts our work. A lot of our work on the ground has increasingly focused on digital. So a few things that are important for us that stood out in UNGA Summit of the Future is digital public goods for child's rights, digital public infrastructure. I know both Sally and Rob has mentioned about it a lot, but our angle and our vantage point is really to see what is the impact, and we know there will be immense impact of digital public infrastructure of a child's life from birth all the way to child online safety, and not to mention that we add on top of the dimension of AI for child's rights. Some of the central digital themes that I thought it is particularly significant, in my opinion, is the topic of DPIs no longer is something that we talk about within the UN organizations. The 15.5 event that galvanized 22 countries to come together and support it is a strong testament of the demand on the ground that that it's a force that we definitely should see it coming in a big way, that the whole UN organization actually supported. I continue to want to raise the topic of minding the gap of digital inequality and the notion of child online safety, AI for child's rights, as we adult in the room during UNGA talk about the future that we want to build, the digital future that we want to build. It is very important that we also think about the children that were not there, and we are talking about the future that we are building for them. So child's rights in the center of part of the human rights is also very important as a central theme. Last but not least, UNICEF being a strong supporter of digital public goods, we also walk the talk. This year, we were very proud and humbled by the fact that OKY is an open source DPG that's built by Girls for Girls to help them understand their sexual menstruation health, won the SDG Game Changer Award of SDG Digital. So these three elements of DPI really be very mindful about child's rights in the digital world and support the implementation of DPGs and really help break down barriers and advance human rights in the digital world are some of the key themes that I want to emphasize. Over back to you, Ursula. I hope that resonates.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that child rights perspective, and congratulations on the Game Changer Award. That was really exciting. Now we're going to turn from children to youth perspectives, and we're so lucky to have two. So first of all, to you, Luisa Franco Machado, young leader for the SDGs UN Network of Experts on AI. A question for you. You have shaped digital at the UN through your role and your contributions to the UN Network of Experts on AI. What are your main takeaways from UNGA and the Summit of the Future as far as digital is concerned?
Hi, Ursula. Hi, everyone. Just jumping right in, I think the Summit of the Future made one thing very clear, which is that digital development is inherently about power dynamics. Even if not with these words, we've heard how technologies we're building today are not neutral. They reflect the priorities of those who control them. I think that one of the most powerful insights from the summit was the shift from merely bridging the digital divide to addressing digital sovereignty. So it's not enough for communities, particularly in the global south, to have access to digital tools. We must also have control over those tools, how these tools are developed, deployed, and especially governed, right? So the theme of digital self-determination was a really refreshing step forward, signaling a more ambitious vision for truly inclusive digital development. Something I personally brought to the summit in my interventions was the need to rethink how we approach AI governance, not just by talking about diversity in vague terms, but by challenging how power structures influence the very design of AI systems. So I stressed how AI systems are often designed with a one-size-fits-all mentality, which fails to account for the complex realities of marginalized communities. And I saw other people talking about that too, about how we need to create AI systems that are adaptive to diverse contexts and not just retrofitted with band-aid solutions when they fail to serve underrepresented groups, which we really want to cater for. Another key insight I pushed was around data governance, particularly how it relates to gender and LGBTQIA+ identities. While there is an increasing recognition of the need for inclusive data practices, what's often missing is the recognition that data collection frameworks are sometimes flawed. We need to build digital frameworks that allow for multiple evolving identities to coexist within data ecosystems. Otherwise, we risk reinforcing exclusionary norms rather than dismantling them. And this is something that I've heard as well, and I was really, really proud to hear. By the way, as you mentioned, and you might have noticed, I'm younger than most of you, probably younger than all of you, actually. But I think that one thing is clear. My insights are no less informed, no less evidence-based, and no less valuable than anyone else's. At the summit, youth got some well-deserved spotlight, but it often seemed more symbolic than truly integrated into decision-making processes. At the Global Compact Leaders Summit, happening with the Summit of the Future, I talked about how older leaders are often either afraid of young leaders or dismissive of us. The truth is, if we're going to tackle the challenges of the digital era, it's gonna take all of us working together across generations to shape the future with the urgency it demands. Now, to wrap it up, the summit laid the groundwork, but if we're truly able to build an inclusive digital future, we must focus on who holds the power in the government and deployment of technologies. And the future of digital development will depend on equitable governance, diverse representation beyond the box, and especially truly inclusive data frameworks with youth at the forefront of it. So over to you, Ursula, and I'm really excited to hear Yash.
Fantastic, Louisa. Thanks so much, and great powerful call to action as well. So yes, we're going to turn to you, Yash. You're the UN Youth Technology Focal Point. Like Louisa, you've been very active in youth-led advocacy for many years, and the Summit of the Future really stressed the need for increased youth participation, like we were just hearing from Louisa. Why is an inclusive approach essential when it comes to our progress in digital, and where do you think the UN stands, or where it might be lacking and can improve?
Thank you so much. Oh wow, that's the million-dollar question, right? Thank you for this opportunity. Such an esteemed panel, and I'm doing my PhD in sociology and computer science, so to hear Louisa speak always energizes me for the work that I do and to continue doing it more. And I think to begin with, the Secretary General has called young people, children and youth, as the torchbearers of the 2030 agenda, and then subsequently he had the Youth 2030 strategy put in place, and I invite many of the entities are a part of the strategy. But if you are not already aware, I invite you to familiarize yourself with the 2030 youth strategy. And also I want to share that I'm the technology focal point for the major group for children and youth. And like many of us, it really started the year before, right? We were all asked to start putting together interventions for the consultations for the GDC and the Pact. And as the major group for children and youth, we organized over 45 consultations around the world, with each Zoom session having around 300 young people, leaders, and children right leaders. And some of the things that we really saw come up were that young people, and there is appetite now within the UN system and the member states, that young people are not just beneficiaries of actions and policies, but they're also partners and leaders. I mean, there's 1.2 billion young people, and I think ITU put out the statistic that by 2020, in 2020, 71% of the world's young people are connected in some form or the other. But it's that other 30% that it's the most hard to bring on to the connection and the network. But also the consultations with young people, what came up was that it's not enough to just connect young people, because with the connection comes a lot of the risks and the various privacy, security, mental health issues that we're seeing. I think there was a statistics that came out that 35% of young women or adolescent girls who are using social media often think of themselves as being less or perceive themselves to be less attractive, or their body image was often impacted in a negative manner because of social media. So when we're trying to connect everyone in the world, we have to ensure that we connect them in a safe, secure, responsible way. And I think the Global Digital Compact, what it does really well is in the principles and values, it centers human rights. And with it being the first document of its nature in the world, to have those human rights language centered is a big win. when it comes to implementation, there's a lot left, because I think we see the intergovernmental nature of the process has not just reduced civil society's voice and space, but also in the operationalization of the digital compact, we've seen that a lot of policies, member states, and as our colleagues mentioned, they put in place things that we needed 10 years ago. So I think we've caught up, but again, we don't want a document that goes out of date in 5 years. So I think as the UN system, we need to take this document as the language and the base setting, and we need to build from here. This document, the compact is just the beginning, and I think the SG himself says the pact is just the beginning. And I think I want to close by saying it really takes intergenerational collaboration. And I think at UNGA, the really beautiful thing was on Saturday was the Digital Action Day. On Friday was the Youth Action Day, and we had a digital session. And again, it was co-convened by the UN Youth Office and the Major Group for Children and Youth, with support from UNDP, ITU, WIPO, UNFP, and many other entities in the other sessions. But in our session, actually, we worked really close together, and we saw that young people around the world, they're actually changing the system, even if they don't have the support. We had the Generation 17, the ITUSG advisory board members. They showed all the innovative ways in resource-limited contexts how young people are changing the world. And I think as the UN system, we need to start supporting those more and move on from programmatic interventions to scaling them. And I think I would conclude by saying digital is good, but at the end of the day, digital and AI have to be centered in the human experience. And art, creativity, mental health, those are really integral to the human experience. And in our race to technology, we cannot leave behind what is truly important and valuable.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Yash. And I'm really pleased as well that you talked about connectivity, and not just that it has to be universal, but the importance of it being meaningful with all the different elements that you brought out. And it's great that in the Global Digital Compact that is explicit, the meaningful pieces there. And that's a wonderful segue, actually, to turn to part 2 of this session, where we're going to have a closer look at the outcome documents, so a couple of them from the Summit of the Future, in particular, briefly on the pact and a bit more detail on the Global Digital Compact. And so I'm pleased to invite you, Isabel de Sola Criado, just to share what are the most important results as it relates to the GDC and its successful adoption. A great day for digital, as ITU Secretary General said. What do you think is or will be its impact, and what do you consider to be its most important elements?
Great, thank you, Ursula. Is my camera back on?
It is not, Isabel.
I cannot see it. Now we can,
better.
yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Isabel. I'm very happy to go after Yash as well, because one of my ideas about the most important takeaways from the Global Digital Compact's approval is the way in which it makes room for new actors at the table of digital cooperation. So Yash was speaking to the part about youth getting involved and intergenerational cooperation. And I think that the GDC spirit and several of its paragraphs explicitly take steps in order to ensure that the digital cooperation we take forward from now on is more inclusive. And it's more inclusive in what way? We already had pretty inclusive setups and mechanisms from before with the WSIS process, with the World Summit on the Information Society. I think one element that the GDC takes forward on that note is to add in actors that perhaps weren't as active or as present at the time in the digital space as when WSIS was negotiated. So youth is one, but also vulnerable persons, refugees, handicapped persons with disabilities. There's several shout outs, and also the role of tech companies. So the document makes 10 requests of tech companies very specifically, and developers. For example, starting out with the most important one, which is to respect international human rights principles and apply human rights due diligence throughout the life cycle of tech products. It asks them to respect human rights online, but also take steps to mitigate and remedy abuse. It encourages them to engage with users of all backgrounds and have a more diverse approach to addressing their needs. And this list of 10 requests to tech companies, I think, was reflected in the presence at UNGA and at the Digital Action Day of many of the big tech bosses. There's a question in the Q&A button about how we can influence the VC-driven nature of digital development. And I think that having the big tech bosses present with us at the UNGA is a step in the right direction. Sundar Pichai, CEO of Google, was at GA. Brad Smith, CEO of Microsoft, he's a familiar face at GA, but we also had Sam Altman from OpenAI. And they were caught in the tornado that was the discussion on digital. And I believe that they left the GA having heard very clearly from all different stakeholders these concerns about inclusivity, about diversity, about focusing development of the technology on development goals. So that's one outcome that I think is very important from the GDC and the UNGA together. A second outcome is to strengthen the handshake that needs to continue happening between multi-stakeholder processes and intergovernmental processes. So the GDC lays out in a few specific paragraphs requests for follow-up that combine multi-stakeholder approaches, consultations, working groups, forums with an intergovernmental process that could solidify and cement the results of the multi-stakeholder consultation. I'll give an example. The GDC calls for the creation of a working group on data governance as it relates to development in the framework of the CSTD, the Commission on Science, Technology, and Development, based here in Geneva. And while the working group will be multi-stakeholder, the results of its deliberations will be delivered to an intergovernmental process that's overseen by the ECOSOC. And in that way, it will be lifted up to the level of parliamentary action, of national action. And this is what I mean by shaking hands, multi-stakeholderism and intergovernmental processes. Another example of that relates to the outcomes of the GDC on artificial intelligence. The Secretary General's high-level advisory body on AI was a parallel multi-stakeholder process that was ongoing from October last year all the way through to the GDC. So it had very little time, this multi-stakeholder advisory body, to come up with its recommendations. But by acting in parallel to the GDC and feeding its information and thoughts to the member states, some of those proposals, which you may be familiar with, are approved by the GDC. One is an independent international scientific panel. A second proposal is a global dialogue on AI governance. And a third proposal invites the Secretary General to think about innovative financing mechanisms for capacity building on AI. And these results were possible really by combining the best of a multi-stakeholder process with the Baroque or, very nation-state focused diplomatic processes of a global negotiation. And I think the outcome speaks for itself. It's very exciting that the UN and member states and stakeholders will take forward those proposals within the next year. So I could go on and on, Ursula, but I know that we want to get on to the next questions, and looking forward to the questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Isabel. And a little plug, I believe the link is going to be in the chat. The Digital Community of Practice is actually going to do a deeper dive session on Thursday, October 17th at 9 a.m. New York time. And one can apparently, in the chat, there's the info on how to register for that for more detail. So now we're going to turn back to our larger panel. including you, Isabel, for this point, for phase 3 of this session. And this is on actionable takeaways from the UN General Assembly and Summit of the Future. And it's just one question, and it's a brief answer, just for 1 to 2 minutes. And the question is, what are the next steps to ensure that we make the takeaways from the Summit of the Future actionable and to make the commitments of the Global Digital Compact a reality? And I think a number of you already hinted at some of this, but here's a chance to really emphasize and support our audience with your key takeaways on this point. So Rob, you're first. What are the next steps and how do we make these reality and actionable?
Sure. Well, I think for UNDP, where we're engaged with about 125 countries on digital programming, the GDC gives us a kind of an umbrella, right, where we can, or a way of like a kind of a coat hanger with coat hooks so that we can kind of attach our programming to what is there in terms of principles at the GDC, and in some cases, the commitments. And so for us, when it comes to advocating for things like digital public infrastructure or digital capacity, this is an important reference point that we can use to really help guide our programming and our discussions with government. I think the other things, just more concretely, the DPI safeguards work that has been done and the framework that has been launched now enters into a new phase of implementation with countries. So over the next year or so, we'll be taking that one level deeper in terms of implementing at the country level and really learning and supporting country level decision making and things like that when it comes to how to implement the safeguards. And then I think I would just sort of, last thing I would say is, kind of back to that capacity building theme. And I see there's a couple questions in the Q&A around digital literacy and something that I also want to mention that was put in there by, I think, someone named Minu, which is, how can we talk about all this stuff when there isn't basic electricity reaching people and people don't have connectivity? And the way that we look at this is that it is not a question of either or sequentially doing these things. We need to take care of the fundamental the fundamental infrastructure that needs to be there. And of course, all of the types of things, whether it's basic connectivity or electrification, digital literacy, those all have to be done. But the reality is the technology development is not slowing down, and governments need to be able to start building their muscles out in terms of understanding how to govern technology so that people's privacy and data are protected, because inevitably these technologies are going to be deployed. And so it's a matter of doing both that we have to focus on. So I'll leave it there, Ursula. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. Sally, over to you. What are the next steps and how do we make things actionable?
Thanks, Ursula. I'll go for the brownie points. So very, very fast. I think the most important thing is to agree on an effective and inclusive implementation mechanism for the GDC. As Rob mentioned, each of our UN agencies are going to find our hooks on which to hang things that we're already doing programmatically, but the bringing it together, the orchestration, the coordination, the joint reporting, the impact assessment and measurement has to come through an effective governance and implementation mechanism. So I'm hoping that this is what's going to happen in the next few months. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sally. And definitely at ITU, we've been mapping the GDC and our different initiatives as well in a variety of settings. So Fu Meng, over to you.
Thanks, Ursula. I think the hooks analogy is pretty popular here. Maybe I'll change it a little bit, is to say that GDC really gives us the roadmap. And we are seeing in UNICEF in over 160 country offices that we operate in, we're seeing the demand coming from our country offices asking, what does it mean for them? What does it mean for them to have the discussion with the ministers of education, health and things like that? That's where I think the rubber hit the road. And that's where collectively as UN agencies, different UN agencies, we could come together as a UN country team, UN country teams in all the countries and really break it down into contextualize the GDC into country context. So to the point of Louisa and Yesh, this doesn't become an afterthought. And we also have to be very mindful about policy. Policy can never run faster than technology. That's a fact. So how do we bring that balance and really bring GDC into a reality by doing a lot of co-creations on the ground? It would be, you know, something fantastic that we can bring GDC into reality. Over back to you, Ursula.
Thank you so much. Isabel, we just had a very brief introduction by you to the GDC, etc. But here's your chance to say a little bit more about next steps and how we can make these commitments a reality.
Sure, absolutely. And it's really an answer to Sally's question, which is echoed on the Q&A, is what happens next? So the GDC paragraph 71 or 74 asks the Secretary General to deliver an implementation map as early as April 2025 via the Commission on Science and Technology for Development, which oversees the reporting on WSIS. And this is a nice way to give us a very short amount of time to connect the GDC mapping to WSIS structures, to take the best of what is already happening and to connect it to this new policy umbrella. The process of the implementation mapping should be really a bottom-up or a ground-up exercise where all of the stakeholders are invited to tell us what they're doing, tell us what their plans are for the next 3 years, we hope. And the tool will be part of the April report, but also should live online afterwards so that users can come to this map and have a look and see which other players, which other agencies, and what parts of the world are working on which objectives. So if that doesn't sound ambitious, well, our team, the Tech Envoys team, feels we're under a lot of pressure to deliver this in a record amount of time. I think the Tech Envoy, Amandeep Singhil, will host a town hall to announce plans within the next month or so that should be inclusive and easy to get involved in. And to Sally's point, they should assist the system to deliver efficiently. This is what we're looking for, more impact. So stay tuned, keep an eye on this space, and more news to follow shortly.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Louisa, what would you like to say? You gave us a wonderful, powerful call to action before. What would you like to reiterate in terms of next steps and how we make this actionable and reality?
To make this reality, if we don't tackle the governance structures that keep marginalized communities on the fringes, the Global Digital Compact and the Pact of the Future will remain just another promise on paper. So they should be a hook for new governance models that give real decision-making power to those who have been excluded for too long. An example that's close to heart, we need to move beyond youth advisory boards and start including young people on AI advisory boards, where actually the decisions are made. Connectivity alone isn't the goal, it's ethical infrastructure. Government and tech companies must be held accountable for creating systems that truly serve people, not just profits. The focus has to shift to who controls the data and whether the system reflects the needs of the communities they are meant to serve. So if marginalized groups aren't involved in designing these systems, the tech will continue to perpetuate inequality. And in my opinion, digital equity is impossible without intersectional feminism. Intersectionality must be integrated into all layers of digital governance, ensuring that women, LGBTQIA+ individuals, and racial minorities are not just present, but leading these conversations. And to wrap it up, we really need real accountability mechanisms. Progress can't be measured by access alone. It must be who gets to make the key decisions. And we need to shift from just providing access to ensuring that marginalized communities have a say in shaping their digital futures.
Thank you so much, Louisa. And Yash, the last word before we come to our Q&A.
Echoing everything Louis has said, I'm going to combine two things, something that Louis has said, but also something that Isabel said. It truly is going to take a handshaking between multi-stakeholder and intergovernmental processes. But in the multi-stakeholder processes, it's really important that we engage existing multi-stakeholder processes which already bring marginalized voices to the table. There's the major groups on different demographic groups, but also stakeholders. How are we ensuring that their voice is not being silenced in the process? Because it cannot be only who already speak at the UN, already have access. It has to be expanded. And also we have to ensure that the AI panel, the SG scientific board, they have a young person on them, and that youth thematic issues are not a separate issue, but they're a part of every issue. And I think it's important to recognize here that they're not just coming there to represent a group, but the experiences of young people now are significantly different. We have a generation that has been born with access to all the information on the internet. We have a generation where every moment of their life has been documented. And those lived experiences are very different from our policymakers. And it's not something that can be researched, or it cannot be something that can be consulted. Young people and children have to voice themselves. And I think the second thing, which many of you alluded, but it's really important that we don't just focus on putting all our efforts on technology development. We can develop as responsible of an AI technology as possible, but if we don't focus on literacy, digital data, and AI, all of the efforts can lead to many misconceptions, perceptions. I think I was reading a research article about half of the cybersecurity issues in the world are not actually technology. They happen at the human end of the process. So it's really important that we invest in civic engagement and literacy at all levels, along with the technology development. And especially in countries which are trying to scale and get into the race, as many people said, to technology, we also need to support them, infrastructure, but also with resources to engage.
Thank you so much, Yash. And we've actually had a number of questions come in, which is very exciting. I think some of them have been addressed in the course of the comments from our speakers. But let's just look at a round of them now, and then we'll come back to our speakers in one go. And just a reminder, you can upvote the questions. And so we're using that to identify these ones. First, we have a question from Sufyan. Question from UN Iraq. On digital inclusion, what measures are being taken to ensure that digital transformation efforts do not exacerbate existing inequalities, particularly for marginalized communities? A question from Anna. How do you envisage the work between UN agencies and other development agencies to use limited resources in an efficient way while generating impact? And also a key one with lots of UN staff in the audience today, how can we as individual UN staff take action on integrating these insights, such as we've heard today, into our work? Now, let's see if we've got any, maybe we just look at a couple more. Let's see. Okay, how can these commitments be realized at the country level, and what role actors and stakeholders can have to translate the commitments to action? Yeah, so given that we don't have too much time left, can I, on the basis of these questions, and I think you all, our lovely speakers also can see the questions, so feel free if there's one in there that you want to address. Let us give you all just about a minute, it's not too much. We're going to start this time with you, Yash, so we're going to go from the reverse order. Are there any of the questions that we've outlined or that you see in the chat that you want to bring in some further perspectives on? And please do try and be 1 minute so that we can finish on time.
Yeah. I think we have really amazing colleagues who do lead a lot of country offices, so I'm going to leave that question to them. But I think something that's really meaningful is to, at the grassroots level, support youth organizations with getting involved in policy making. Because a lot of times we have a lot of grants and funding models, but they're really hard to access for capacity building. They're often for programs and interventions. So we really need to invest in empowering young people to become leaders at the grassroots level. And I think I put in the chat, there's many stakeholder processes that are going to be coming up, the IGF, CSTD, AI for Good, the World Social Summit, not just the WSIS 2020, support young people with resources to engage in these spaces, because these spaces can be very hard to access. So I think we need to do a better job on making them visible and also accessing them.
Thank you so much, Yash. And then we'll turn to Louisa. Just before we do, let me just say as well, I believe that our speakers are also able to type responses. So, feel free also to do that so we can maximize our responsiveness to our fantastic questioners. Louisa, any of the questions that we highlighted or ones you see in the Q&A there that you would like to add to? The answers, I should
Definitely. I would say that, well, in that question about development agencies and the UN on implementing the pact and using resources, I think what we really need to pay attention to, and I'm saying this because I worked for a long time in a development agency, is that a lot of the decisions made, they're a mix of technical and political. So if you want to influence how these resources are going, you really need to come to the core of what's behind the decision making. So is it a political pact? Is it a partnership between countries? And when you try to see what's behind the decisions made, that's when you can influence it and direct it to other areas. Now, going more directly to youth participation in GDC and the Pact and Summit of the Future. I can really tell any young people involved here that you should really get involved with the UN Youth Office. That's where I am a young leader for the SDGs from, and they really uplift a lot of the participation of young people in these processes. But of course, it can always get better. So I also invite all of the older leaders here to involve meaningfully young people in your processes, not just as beneficiaries or advisors, but really those leading those conversations. And I'm happy to answer questions privately later. Just add me on LinkedIn.
Thank you so much, Louisa. Isabel, any of the questions that we had that you want to respond to briefly? And we really need to stick it down to 1 minute. Apologies, guys.
Yeah, I wanted to speak on the questions about as well inclusivity and working better together. I see a lot of potential in the proposal for an independent international scientific panel to realize, meaning to make concrete some of these aspirations. So when it comes time to composing the panel, we'll see where the rubber meets the road. As you know, for the moment, the concept and the modalities of the international panel will be in the hands of the member states. And they'll go through a process now in New York to define what it looks like. But you can count on these ideas that we've spoken on today about inclusivity, about marginalized communities, about having different types of expertise and stakeholders on this panel, of making sure that it's representative of the world. I think those are our spirits, concepts, principles, ideas that will have a lot of influence over the conversation amongst the member states to bring it together. And they have until the end of this GA to do so. So what I finished my last comment on, I'd like to say again, is watch this space, or see how you can play a role in those conversations, and we'll work together to ensure that there's the best outcome.
Thank you, Isabel. Fumeng, 1 minute.
All right, maybe I'll try to take the question about digital inclusion and why do we not see health in GDC? I think the approach that we're taking, UNICEF is taking to make sure that digital inclusion and we leave no one behind, is really rooted on the strong principle of digital by design, some of the key principles that, globally is being used. More importantly, we are also very, very strong on human-centered design, because you have to design with the user. If you don't design with the user, of course, they can't come along. So that are some of the interventions that we use to make sure that we're inclusive as well by walking the talk. The other part about health is barely included in the GDC. To be honest with you, GDC is there can be so many pages. It's impossible to include everything under the sun. However, health is prime for the digital public infrastructure. Why? Health system is an infrastructure for all the countries. So if we think about the narrative of digital public infrastructure from a child perspective, from birth, education, health, getting vaccination, that's how we see that health can be pivoted or be anchored into the GDC. I hope that answers some of the questions.
Thank you so much, Sally. And Rob, you're the last speaker, the last word. We're going to close out with you.
I think you missed Sally, though. That was for me.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So, Sally, please. Thank you, Rob, for that. Apologies, jumping ahead of myself. Sally, please, let's hear from you in a really important environmental perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Always ever the gentleman. I'll be very quick. I'll just tackle the question on environmental sustainability of AI. I actually pasted the link to the issues note by UNEP in the chat, which covers a lot of what was asked in the question regarding the entire footprint of the whole value chain of AI from source to destination. So starting from raw materials all the way to waste and e-waste, but also looking at secondary and tertiary effects. This will be the beginning, not the end of the conversation. And so the idea is for us to engage until at least the end of next year with the provision of more research, more knowledge products, and of course cooperation across UN agencies and with the wider world, civil society, and so on, to really try and quantify that footprint and see how we can mitigate it. So stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Watch this space. Rob, over to you now.
Thanks, Ursula. I know I'm on borrowed time, so
1 minute.
Yeah. The question that was in there, how do we make sure digital transformation is benefiting people, right? I'm paraphrasing. I mean, this is the whole step forward we're taking generationally with the Global Digital Compact. Technology is not neutral. It needs to be shaped by people to ensure that it benefits people. And this is why UNDP puts at the heart of our entire digital work and the guiding principles we have in our digital strategy. The first one is human rights, and the second one is about inclusion, including marginalized communities. So whenever around the world, when we work with governments in support of digital transformation, we have to put that spirit at the heart of it. And the GDC puts out that call for us all to do that on a systematic basis. So wherever you are, whatever level you are, whether you're working in a global team or you're at the country level or you're in civil society, this is the call to action for us to put people and their rights at the center of technology work.
Fantastic point to end on. And so with that, we'd like to thank all our speakers, thank all our fantastic questioners and audience. As mentioned, there will be a follow-up session that the Digital Community of Practice will have on Thursday. You can register in the chat, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Over.
Thanks, Julia and Johanna.
Thank you, Ursula.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you all very much.